Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Oleski, and welcome to The Upside. We're very excited to welcome you to our virtual show, which is brought to you by the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore and JMOR Magazine. If you have any questions for our guests today, be sure to type them into the Zoom chat or message us via JMOR's Facebook page. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce your hosts, Beth Goldsmith, Chair of the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore, and Dr. Scott Rifkin, publisher of JMOR. Beth and Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. Located in the Jonestown neighborhood in East Baltimore, the Jewish Museum of Maryland, JMM, is part of the Associated System, and we are proud to say is one of the leading Jewish museums in the country. Over the years, its galleries and the two synagogues that make up its campus have told the story of Jewish Maryland, immigration, the Holocaust, and more to hundreds of thousands of visitors, educators, and students alike. Yet when COVID-19 hit, like many museums, the JMM began to think of new ways to connect and to educate the public. At the same time, the museum welcomed a new executive director to take over from the retiring Marvin Pinkert. As we begin to come out of the pandemic, the museum has a unique opportunity to reinvent itself. What could the JMM look like 5 or even 10 years from now? Scott, please introduce our guest.
Great, thank you, Beth, as always. Today, we're excited to have Sal Davis, the new executive director of the museum. Sal moved here from Tucson, and I just spent a month in Tucson, and it is beautiful. It is 180-degree different environment than Maryland. I mean, you can't get much different with the cactus and the Sonoran Desert and these big pig-like animals that run all over the place in herds. And it's really pretty amazing. So Sal, what motivated you to move from Tucson? And tell us a little bit about your work there.
Sure. Thank you all for having me on. Those big pig-like animals are called javelinas. I'm very familiar with those. I've had some frightening encounters with them in my time in the Sonoran Desert. In terms of your question, what drew me to the position? One is I've known about the Jewish Museum of Maryland in my work at the Jewish History Museum in Tucson. That's what I would call a small museum. And in the field of Jewish museums, you have many small museums like the Jewish History Museum in Tucson, and you have some large ones like the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, or the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philly, or the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. And then you have some mid-sized museums. And I would consider the Jewish Museum of Maryland a mid-sized museum. And in the Jewish museum world, I've sort of come to know the Jewish Museum of Maryland and the Oregon Jewish Museum, which is in Portland, as the two strongest mid-sized Jewish museums. So I've known about the work of the museum, I've known its reputation, and I have also known two of its past directors, Avi Dechter, and then of course, Marvin Pinkert, who was somebody I met at one of the very first Jewish museum conferences I went to in New York several years ago. And then I've known other staff members, and I know the Jewish Museum, not only by its reputation, but part of that reputation is as an incubator for great museum professionals who go on to do other things across the field. So it was the reputation, and also I'm interested in Baltimore as a city for many reasons. Also, this museum has some similarities with the museum in Tucson, and I loved the work there. And part of it was a museum that's rooted in one of its primary structures being a historic synagogue building. So in Tucson, there in the museum I worked at there's a synagogue building, which was the foundational building of the museum. And it's one of the oldest synagogues in the American Southwest. It's the oldest synagogue in the Arizona territory, the only one that predated statehood in Arizona. And here, of course, we have the Lloyd Street Synagogue. So there's those spaces which I feel have so much potential as places where we can activate and live and resonate Jewish values out into the community. That's part of it. And another thing is that both of these museums, Tucson and Baltimore, are adjacent to downtown, where there's not a tremendous amount of Jewish community infrastructure currently, but that where there used to be. So those are some similarities. And I just find there's a tremendous potential in that sort of the specifics of those sites.
Very good.
That's such a great lead in to what I was going to ask, which is you talk about potential. So what is your vision? What are or visions for, how you see the new JMM?
Right. I mean, in terms of the entire field of museums, there's so much change. I don't think it can be overstated. It's a dramatic time for change. And museums are always changing, but this is a time of accelerated change because of COVID has really changed the work. So for example, part of the work is always to bring people to the museum, but now the work is really to bring the museum to the people through the digital in many ways. I mean, of course, once circumstances allow, we want to bring people back into the museum as much as possible and continue to build out all that we've learned through COVID in terms of digital outreach and digital programming, virtual exhibitions, and giving people meaningful experiences that happen remotely. So the future of the museum is really a hybrid that includes all the best of the past and strategizing around what we've learned in the last year to continue to do digital outreach, which allows us to forge partnerships without any sort of geographical limitations. We can partner with Jewish museums and other kinds of museums all across the country with much greater ease now. So I really look forward to really getting into that partnership, doing the partnership work. And coming out of COVID, I think a lot of the work of the museum is to ask itself, how can a museum serve a community in these circumstances? These are really challenging times. Right now, the museum has just staged an exhibition called In the Absence of a Proper Mourning. And that's one way of answering the question, what can a museum do for a community during these times? And what that exhibition does is basically bear witness to people's loss. So we were working together with an artist based in New York, who's interviewed people across various communities within Baltimore who've experienced loss and grief and are mourning through COVID, to really hold space for that, to bear witness to their grief, and to listen and to hold that. And I think that's one important role of a museum, which may not be so intuitive, is to help a community heal at this time. Art museums are going to do that in a certain way. And Jewish museums are within the genre of museums called culturally specific museums, which is it's a different subset of the museum world. And I think one of the things that a culturally specific museum can do is help us heal by building relationships across the community and really being a place of listening and responding to community needs. And I look forward to doing that in a variety of ways. That's part of, the core of my vision, is to be sort of responsive and community-based. I believe in a kind of socially engaged practice for museums, which is really engaging the community and serving as a platform to realize various community aspirations and build relationships within that.
Very good. So talk about the pandemic and the effect it had on the museum, and talk about how you've adapted what you do and your outreach to what you can do in light of the pandemic.
Right. So, I mean, as I said, so many museums, we've been forced to really accelerate the work of going digital. The Jewish Museum of Maryland has been recording all of its programs for the duration of COVID. So now we have this rich archive of digital recorded material. It's a new sort of archive, the archive of content generated within the context of COVID. And if you think about that, it's an important record. One of the functions of a museum is documentation, keeping the records, stewarding an archive. And these programs themselves are a new archive. They're a record of how our community grappled with these times, because again, the museum's content and programming and exhibits are in so many ways responsive to the world that we live in and to our community. One thing I've been particularly impressed with in terms of the work of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I started to engage with this before I left Arizona, was the series of programs around Jews of color, and Jewish institutions in the age of Black Lives Matter. That wasn't a one-off program. It's a programmatic series that I believe now has up to 10 programs within it. So to think about just the content within that conversation that's now been documented by the Jewish Museum of Maryland during, of course, all of the upheaval that began in the summer of 2020, that's an important record for us to reflect on and look back on as to how the Jewish community in Baltimore and across Maryland has been grappling with issues of racial justice inside the context of a global pandemic.
So talk about kids for a minute. It always struck me that by the time you get to be an old person like me, museums are really interesting, but that's not really who the target is. The target has got to be younger folks to pass history along to them. So take a little bit of time, if you would, and walk through your programmatic offerings for the littler kids, for the middle school kids, for the teenage kids, the high school kids, and then for young adults, if you don't mind breaking into those groups.
Sure. You know, I mean, the major entry point for people of that age is the education program. Of course, that's also been disrupted by COVID. So now that's also happening primarily through the digital outreach. So, you know, the main entry point for middle and high school students is typically through the educational program, engaging with the content, the history of Jews in Maryland, Holocaust-related content, et cetera.
Yeah, but how do you liven it up so that they actually listen?
Good. Okay. So that's a real challenge. I mean, that's a real tough nut to crack. And one thing I'm looking forward to is a program that our program team has just cooked up. It's a programmatic series that's highlighting, and it's aimed for families with young children. And the program is about representing global Jewish life by highlighting the culture of Jewish people all over the world. And when you talk about culture, we're talking about foods. So it includes, you know, recipes and baking. These are action-based programs, baking or cooking foods from, you know, Jewish traditions in Tunisia, for example, or listening to Jewish music that comes from Turkey. So that's a programmatic series that's coming up that not only helps younger people understand the dynamism and diversity of Jewish life around the world, but it brings flavor, literal flavor through the food, the music, and various cultural sort of interactive pieces. Again, this is not happening at the museum. So there's a lot of work going into designing these programs, sending out materials to those who register in advance so that they can cook along as they're encountering a Jewish person from Tunisia, for example, who's teaching how to bake like a Jewish sweet from a North African tradition.
Yeah, it's just, you know, I have little grandchildren now. And when they go to the museum, they go to some children's museums that are so just incredibly well thought out. And it really reaches them to see my 3-year-old grandson in a fire engine or with his hands in a fish tank. He's learning something. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could do the same sort of things with the Jewish history that they're exposed to at the museum?
Absolutely. I mean, another way to do that is to bring in programmatic content, for example, like a PJ Library program, but have it happen in the Lloyd Street Synagogue. So you're inside of the historic space. You're bringing in content that's been developed for that audience in particular, but they're having the experience not in their home, but within the the historic site of a Lloyd Street Synagogue or a B'nai Israel, for example. So that's another approach. It's a challenge. I mean, that's a real challenge to make these culturally specific museums attractive to younger audiences. Absolutely.
And how about
I'm going to jump in, Scott? I'm going to jump in.
Right.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, because Saul, you've mentioned where you are, and Jonestown is certainly a distinctive area. You guys have been a leader in the redevelopment of that community. How do you see that role continuing?
I want to continue to deepen that role. that's another thing that attracted me to this position, actually, to go back to the first question. In Tucson, the museum was located in a neighborhood called Barrio Viejo, which is the oldest neighborhood in Tucson, adjacent to downtown. Here we have the historic Jonestown neighborhood, still with this historic temple building in it. And it can be a real anchor for the community. It's the Jewish center of the neighborhood. Again, the work of the historic Jonestown initiative has been changed by COVID. But we're deeply invested in continuing to build those relationships and provide a leading role in the work that's happening there. I can't, say with too much detail what exactly that is yet. I've only been to one meeting of the historic Jonestown initiative since arriving, but I do see tremendous potential for it. And I'll also use it as an opportunity just to talk about a few blocks away, the Lewis Museum, a museum of African American history, which again is in this genre of culturally specific museums. I've had several meetings already with their new executive director, who arrived just a month after I did, Terry Freeman. So I started at the museum here in January and she began in February. And there's just so much potential for working together. We kind of bookend that neighborhood, though. I don't know if the Lewis, I don't really know exactly what the formal boundaries of Jonestown are, but the Lewis Museum is just a few blocks away, and having those two museums bracket that neighborhood, there's a tremendous potential inside of that as well that I look forward to realizing.
Very good. So talk a little bit about the plans going forward. Do you have specific exhibits coming down the road that you want people to know about, programs?
Absolutely. I mean, we have to plan with uncertainty. There's still so much uncertainty, which has thrown off exhibition schedules, all over the world. So we were planning to open an exhibition called Blacklist that we are staging. It comes from the Jewish Museum in Milwaukee much earlier. And now that exhibition is slated to open in March of 2022. So about a year from now, we'll have Blacklist. And that opens up about 9 months of time where our gallery, called the Feldman Gallery, where those temporary exhibitions are staged, will be open. And I think it's a great opportunity to experiment with many practices and pilot different projects that can be potentially central to the next iteration of the museum. So we're going to have a 9-month period where we will be purposefully experimenting in the gallery with a range of programs that are going to program with all of the uncertainty in mind. We don't know if we'll be able to have what size of audiences or community members we'd be able to have in that gallery for certain programs, which makes the programming design somewhat complicated. But we're also thinking about really building up the digital infrastructure of the museum. So building programs, I don't know if you or anyone who's listening to this has ever seen an NPR Tiny Desk concert. That's one thing that I continuously think about, because it's high production value and high quality content for a tiny audience in a small space. And it lives most of its life and generates most of its excitement on the internet. And I think that's going to be a feature of museum practices moving forward. So how do we use the Feldman Gallery to do a variety of projects that are kind of based on or using like a Tiny Desk concert as a point of departure? Artist residencies, interviews with people, amplifying various voices, text studies, all kinds of things that I think we can do in there with the high production value, and then generate a lot of energy around through online circulation.
Very cool. And I'm curious about, I've had the privilege of seeing, for instance, Henrietta Zold. You guys had these wonderful historic reenactments with wonderful characters. Any of that going on or being planned?
I know that there's several of those living history figures that are, in the museum's playbook. I don't know how much. I don't think they're getting a lot of action right now during COVID, and I'm not aware of plans currently for developing others. Though I have some ideas. I mean, I think those are very popular, and there's certainly no shortage of compelling figures to draw from to continue to build out the number of living history figures that we present out into the community.
And where do things stand right now? People can come to see the exhibit. What, exactly, is there a limit? Do you need to call for an appointment? Explain to us how, if people want to come to see you personally, not you personally, but your museum.
You can come visit me. It might be actually easier to come visit me than come visit the museum. And I would love to have some visitors. So please give me a call, send me an email. Unfortunately, on my first day on the job, we ended public visitation in terms of drop-in visitors to the museum in early January because of where positive test rates were around COVID. And we've, continued to monitor the information from public health officials, as all organizations are. Certain museums have reopened in different ways, and all museums are making this decision based on a different set of internal calculations. Where we are currently is the exhibition that opened at the museum in the fall of 2020 called Jews in Space is set to close in mid-June. And we want to make sure that anyone who wants to still engage with that exhibit has an opportunity to. So we're currently doing limited reservation. There's a limited reservation schedule for our members, friends of the museum. So if somebody's interested to experience Jews in Space before it closes in mid-June, they can make reservations, and there's a schedule of dates that are primarily on Thursdays with a few Sundays in there for small groups to visit the museum at this time. And then we'll just continue to monitor and hopefully be able to build back up towards a full reopening. And I hope that comes sooner rather than later.
I've been accused of being in space most of my life, so that's a great exhibit. And I'll have to see that at some point. This show is seen by a limited audience now, but it gets on Facebook and YouTube. We usually get some thousands of people that see it. How do folks reach out to you? Where, talk about the website, phone number, and how do you become a member, and all the different things that you'd like to promote about the usability of your exhit and of the museum.
Sure. I mean, I think that, the primary thing I would say is visit the website, Jewish Museum MD, Jewish Museum, and then md.org. There's all of the information about visitation, about becoming a member. You can also experience the installation that I mentioned earlier in the absence of a proper mourning. All of the content for that installation is on the website as well. And I encourage people to go to that page and absorb some of that content. It's very deep and meaningful. So I would say first, please visit the website, jewishmuseummd.org. Second, be in touch with me. I also hold office hours. I do a sort of a professorial kind of office hours time. And I'm just holding that space on my calendar for people, anyone who wants to make an appointment with me. So that comes out in our newsletter. Another thing you can do when you visit the website is, and I would encourage people to stay informed about the work of the museum by signing up for the weekly newsletter. We're not going to bombard you with a huge amount of emails, but once a week you'll get an update on what's happening at the museum, and you can also sign up for an appointment to meet with me in the office hours. I want to hear from people. What I've been doing for my I just passed 100 days on the job, is just listening, trying to meet as many people as I can, listen to them, listen to their thoughts about the Jewish Museum, listen to their hopes and aspirations for its future. And one of the primary things I'm hearing, and it doesn't even come close in terms of the number of times I've heard this compared to other hopes and aspirations for the museum, and that would be something around, and I think you were kind of alluding to this, Scott, in terms of engaging young people. But what I've really been hearing is diversifying sort of the members of the community that are engaged with the work of the museum. Primarily, I would say, young adult Jewish people or younger adult Jewish people. That's a major goal for me, is to start engaging, across generations. all the way from our core audience to the youngsters you were talking to, Scott, to people more, around my age, younger, just to really build in generational diversity. I mean, it's a Jewish museum. That's where you can do so much of the Lador Vador work across generations and facilitate, as a platform for cross-generational dialogue and the transference of memory and culture and values across generations. I'm really excited to do that. And when you have a space like the Lloyd Street Synagogue, on your campus, that enriches the experience that much more.
Very good. Very good. Beth?
Well, I was going to say, I just want to know, Sal, I mean, we sort of badgered you during your 100-day stay here, but what would you add if given this and you could just speak about anything and tell us anything we haven't asked you about the museum, what would it be?
I guess one thing I've been thinking about a lot, thank you for giving me the open canvas here to paint on, is this museum. It's called the Jewish Museum of Maryland. And something else I've noticed in listening to people is that it's sort of reflexively thought of as a history museum, but it's not called the Jewish History Museum of Maryland. It's called the Jewish Museum of Maryland. I came from a museum that was called the Jewish History Museum. This one is not called the Jewish History Museum, but people think of it as a history museum. Overwhelmingly, that's the case. And that's true. I mean, we're stewards of, this archive, this collection that's really known as one of the most important collections of Jewish material culture in this country. It's such an important treasure that the museum cares for. And the preservation of that record and those materials is central to the work. But it's also a place to enrich Jewish life in the present in all of the many ways I've described and more. But the other thing is, I think of a Jewish museum as a place to imagine the future of Jewish life. And that's something I just don't really see happening in Jewish museums. And it will be a focus for me. I'm really kind of fixated on that. This is a moment for, it's a moment of rupture. There's been a real kind of social and cultural intervention because that's been sparked by COVID and then so many other things that have happened over the last year. But it's some time for us to reimagine the future. And I want to imagine the future at a Jewish museum. I want to have the Jewish museum not just as a place for reflecting on the past, but using those reflections, reflecting on the best of our past, the resilience and brilliance of our ancestors to help inform a better future. What would it be like to imagine Jewish community in the year 2121? I want to ask that question. When we talked about experimenting in the Feldman Gallery, I would love to just interview people there and ask just that question. In the year 2020, we have this record. We've been recording, the Jewish experience of COVID in Baltimore and across the state in a variety of ways, purposefully. I also want us to think about what are our hopes for the Jewish community in 2121. So I'm going to let that question linger out there, and I want to continue to raise it back up, because I think that can inform so much of the work we do right now, to imagine in an expansive way, not a narrow way, but to imagine in the most expansive, creative ways. What do we want for our when we're the ancestors of the descendants who come in 100 years from now?
I am so glad I let you speak at that and tell us what your vision is, because it so embraces what the Associated's vision is, as well, as we are just finishing celebrating our first 100 years and looking to the next 100 and who we can be and how we need to change and adapt to be ready for the next 100 years and those next generations that Scott and I and all of our audience are concerned about bringing into our fold. So thank you. That was just sort of such a brilliant wrap up, unless Scott, you have something else that you need to get in there.
Well, I have a few plugs on other things that I want to finish, but no, this has been great, and Sal's been great. And thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you both. Thank you all for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And we will look forward to seeing you and your museum in person as hopefully things continue to improve in our community. Scott, do you want me to turn it over to you then first? Because you said you have other things you want to share.
I have two quick things to say. One that I say every week, vaccines. Don't be stupid. Get your vaccines. Okay. I give that from a medical perspective. The side effects and the issues are nothing close to what happens if you get COVID. Okay. Item A. Item B is the Baltimore Humane Society is going to be selling thousands of vegetable seedlings and flower seedlings this weekend on Saturday from 10 to 2 at the Quarry Lake Shopping Center and at the Hunt Valley Shopping Center. So if you're a vegetable gardener or you want flowers to plant, show up there between 10 and 2. They're low cost and they help the Humane Society. So thank you. That's all I got, Beth.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. And again, I want to thank Sal for being here today. And I want to thank our audience. I want to thank all of you who have joined us over the past year on The Upside. Each Tuesday, we've had the opportunity to speak with so many interesting guests about what was happening in our community during COVID-19. And now, as summer approaches, we're going to take a break. We hope you'll join us again next fall. We are going to return to The Upside. We're going to be tweaking our format. Not even sure exactly how those tweaks or what those tweaks will look like. So come experience the new Upside with us in the fall. We will be sure to let you know when that's coming. And in the meantime, on behalf of everyone at The Upside, we are encouraging you to keep up with associated.org, jmoreliving.com, sign up for the weekly newsletter. And on behalf of all of us here, we hope you will all have a very safe, happy, and healthy summer.